Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Herr Jesu Christ, dich, wend, which translates to Lord Jesus Christ, turn towards us. Fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of sections that leave some room for interpretation, but all in all, the harmony is mostly functional the way that we would expect it to function, that is, and we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So we have one sharp in the key signature, we start on G major, we end on G major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G major. We move to another G major chord here, G, D, G, and B, no need to reanalyze, and then we have F sharp, D, A, and D, which is D major over F sharp. That's 5-6, and we would typically expect that to go to a 1 chord. 1-5-6-1 is a fairly straightforward and normal introductory chord progression in the chorales. We have G, D, A, and B. Bach often includes that 9/8 suspension over the bass with tonic triads, but we still have a 1 chord here. I'm going to say it's a 1-6 chord because by the time we get the resolution, the bass does change, and that takes us to a 5 chord. D, D, G, and A. And in the same way that we often get 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads, here we have a 4-3 suspension over a dominant triad, which is another common convention that we see in Bach's writing. This is a 5 chord nonetheless. After our 5 chord, we get G major again, G, D, G, and B, tonic triad. Also our gateway to the key of D major. I think we briefly visit D major here. This sounds like a perfect authentic cadence to me. The melody looks like 5-6-7-1 in the key of D major. Passing 7th in the bass here before we get E, E, G, and C sharp, which is C sharp diminished over E. That's 7-6. And then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D. Tonic triad. I think we're going to turn right back around to the key of G major here and call this our 5 chord. This is an example of cadencing in the key of the dominant, where it's sort of just like a glorified half cadence functionally speaking, right? Because D really is still functioning as the dominant. It just feels like we're going a step beyond tonicization here, and we're seeing it actually switch to the tonic. Excuse me, sorry. So after our 5 chord, instead of going to 1 like we would expect, we actually approach this 5 is sort of like a turnaround that then reintroduces the dominant in the key of G. So we start off the phrase with A, C, A, and E, which is our 2 chord, A minor, passing 7th in the bass, and then we go to D major, again, F sharp, D, A, and that, or not the same D, but D in the melody as well, which is 5-6, passing 7th in the melody, and then we go to G major, G, D, A, and B. Notice the 9/8 suspension over the bass again with our tonic triad. Now here's something that's interesting and leaving some room for interpretation, of course. We have a melodic minor fragment here in the key of E minor, C sharp, D sharp, and E. This sounds undeniably like E minor to me, and honestly, if we can modulate to D major over 3 beats, why can't we modulate to E minor over this length of time, especially when E really feels like it's being tonicized in this context? So I do think G is our gateway to the key of, sorry, not G, I was just saying G, so I wrote G, but to E minor. And it's now our 3 chord, and we see an adjacent progression that leads us to the key, or to eventually our tonic in the key of E minor. We have C sharp, E, G, and A, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 5-6-5, sorry, 4-6-5. 4-6-5 here. And then we have D sharp, B, F sharp, and that same A. All of these are non-chord tones as well. This is A, except for the A. This is a 5-6-5 chord, B7 over D sharp, and then we sort of end this cadential progression on E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad, and subsequently our gateway back to the key of G major. So this little brief mid-phrase modulation that takes us back to the key I think the big argument here is whether or not Bach has modulated. Is this an extended tonicization where we just have a 4-5, 4 of 6, 5 of 6, 1, or 4 of 6, 5 of 6, 6 progression? Or have we modulated to E minor? I think all in all, it's sort of on the fence regarding whether or not this is a modulation. To me, I feel like there's enough context here to warrant a modulation as far as the analysis is concerned, but one of the things with analysis is that sometimes there is gray areas where there's nuance and you have to intuit or just stick to a particular analysis for the sake of seeing the material in a particular way. And in this case, I could see it both ways, whether this is like still a secondary progression or if it is a modulation. I chose to analyze it as a modulation, though. We're going to see it again later in the chorale. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that because it is one of the more interesting parts of the chorale from an analytical standpoint. But after 6, we get 4 voices moving off the harmonic rhythm. We got F sharp, we have A, D, and another A here in the melody. This is a passing D major chord over F sharp. Typically when we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm, or really even 3 voices, you can see that there's a chord either being implied or a chord fully spelled out. And with four voice off the harmonic rhythm chords, we typically see a subdivision here. We see 6 going to 5, which is a fairly straightforward progression. And that would take us to 1, G, A, D, and B. Again, with the 9/8 suspension over the bass. I guess technically it's a 2-1 suspension, but 9/8, 2-1, 6 of one, half dozen of another. They're basically the same thing. But then we have D, G, D, and A, which is our 5 chord, D major. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. Again, this idea of the 4-3 suspension being over the 5 chord before we cadence. Perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, tonic triad. G, B, D, and G. Okay, looking ahead to the B section, if this was a binary form, I think it is. It's about binary form. The 2 phrases are sort of similar to one another, like an A-B sort of form, because this next phrase, albeit not identical to the first phrase, it evokes the same harmonic pattern as we see in the first phrase. Just we introduced the key of D major a little bit earlier, but we do end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. We just modulate, like I said earlier, metrically speaking. So we start off the phrase with a D major chord, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord. That takes us to 1, G, D, G, and B, tonic triad, passing tone in the bass, and then we have B, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. But with this C sharp passing in the bass here, I feel like we started the process of the modulation and we're in the key of D here, and this is now our 4-6 chord. Now typically speaking, when we have 4-6 going to 1 in this ascending configuration, Bach will always link the 2 chords with a passing tone, sort of implying a 7 chord here. Sometimes we see the subtonic 7th in minor keys, like we'll see natural 6, natural 7, 1, but the majority of the time we'll see a leading tone connecting these 2 chords, and this is a chord progression that we see more often in major keys than we do in minor keys. So that leading tone is something that's been very consistent across all of the chorales we've seen. We haven't seen a 4-6 to 1 progression that goes through this stepwise motion here that hasn't had the leading tone. At least I can't remember a case where there was. But we do go to 1, D, D, G, and A. It's our tonic triad. Of course, this G is sort of a 4-3 suspension over the bass. It's interesting that we get the 4-3 suspension here over the tonic triad. Maybe it has more to do with D major than having to do with the dominant of the key. Passing tone in the bass, and the resolution just takes the chord and turns it into first inversion. F sharp, A, F sharp, and D. And then here's an interesting chord progression we have here. So subdivided, when we have 2 voices moving, it's always a toss-up as to whether or not we have a subdivided chord progression. Here I feel like the chords are significant, or the notes are significant. The B is a non-chord tone. The D is a chord tone, but that would turn this into a root position 6 chord. And what's cool about that is that we're going to come back around, and this 6 is going to lead us to 2, which is a very normative chord progression that we would expect to see. 6 going to 2, that cycle of falling fifths, root-based motion. 6 often goes to 2 in that context. So we have G, B, E, and that same D as before, which is 2, 6, 5, E minor 7 over G. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. E is a chord tone, G is a chord tone, and then we have A, that same E as before, and then C sharp, which is our 5 chord in the key of D major. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D. Tonic triad, root position, same way as how we went back to the key of G in the second phrase of the A section. We're going to do the exact same thing here. D is now 5, and we're going to move to something that looks kind of like a tonic triad, right? We have G, G, D, and B here, but this F natural offsets the function a little bit. I believe there's a higher function with these chords, and that's implying that this is a 5 of 4 chord. Now the tonic and 5 of 4 look the same. If we didn't have that F natural there, we wouldn't know if it were a tonic or if it were 5 of 4, because the chords are spelled the same until you add the chordal 7th. With this flat 7 here, because in the key of G major we would expect an F sharp, it tells us that that F has a tendency to want to lead down to E, because F and E, that's sort of like the fa and the mi of the C major scale. We would expect this G to be followed by a C major chord. But it's sort of a catch-22, because 1 wants to go to 4 anyways, because of the cycle of falling fifths, but we know that the tonic has a the tonic can function in such a fashion that it can really go anywhere, right? Because it is a stable springboard that any chord can be that any chord can follow. So with that being said, I feel like the F natural here does give us a bit more of a guideline, analytically speaking, and it is followed by a 4 chord, and I don't think that that's just a coincidence in this case. E, G, E, and C, which is a 4 chord in first inversion. This is an example of the tonic functioning as 5 of 4, and that's something that I've been keeping track of in my own personal notes, because I think it's interesting that Bach will resolve to another dominant that will then resolve somewhere. We'll see 5 to 5 of 4 to 4 rather than 5, 1, 4, which would be implying something a little bit different. Very slight. It's like it's minutia, but it's slightly different. And here we have another example of 4-6 going to 1, G, B, D, and B, but the reason why I analyzed that before these 2 passing tones in the lower voices is because, again, this is another example of 4-6 going to 1 with the leading tone connecting the bass notes here, the E and the G, the 6 and the 1 of the scale. But here we're also accompanied with an A, which gives us an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 chord. F sharp, A, C, and E, which is a 7-7 chord. The inversion doesn't matter too much, just so happens that the bass is moving here, so it's going to be root position. But 4 going to 7 going to 1, one of the most common subdivided chord progressions in all of the chorales, maybe even the most common subdivided chord progression. And it typically is followed by a 1 chord, maybe occasionally a 3 chord, but typically speaking a 1 chord. G is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but you might see something similar to what happened here in the second phrase, and that is this C sharp, D sharp, and E, which to me, when you add that C sharp, I feel like that's what really induces the modulation. If it was just a D sharp here, this would just be a secondary dominant chord, and we would just be moving to 6. But I feel like we've moved briefly to the key of E minor here. Because of that C sharp, we're actually fragmenting the scale, and that's what feels more permanent than a tonicization. Of course, there's, like I said, room for debate here. I could see both sides of the argument. I don't think one is correct. I just think that they're both varying outlooks, and to me, from an analytical standpoint, it's more elegant on the page to write in this phrase in the key of E minor, or this fragment of a phrase in the key of E minor, because it reflects E minor, and it's long. It's proportionately long enough to feel like a modulation. But we get the same progression here: C sharp, E, G, and A, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 4/6/5. We then have D sharp as a passing tone, B as a non-chord tone, F sharp as a non-chord tone, and with that A, we have a passing 5/6/5 chord, B7 over D sharp, and that takes us to E minor. E, B, F sharp, and G. Again, another tonic triad with this 9/8 suspension over the bass, a pretty common thing for Bach to do. This E is our actual root or chord tone. It's our tonic triad, and we're just going to be going right back to the key of G major. This is now our 6th chord. Kind of an interesting progression afterwards. We have 6 going to 1/6, B, D, sorry, B, B, D, and G, which is, like I said, 1/6. Kind of an interesting progression. Not typically the most expected progression here. I would expect maybe some type of 2-chord or a 4-chord even, but 1 functioning as a predominant. It's kind of interesting in this context. It feels like perhaps Bach, under more common circumstances, would have an extra beat or so to harmonize. It's interesting that he chose a 1-chord here rather than a 2-chord or a 6-chord or a 4-chord. We have 1/6 with the passing tone here in the bass going to 5, D, A, D, and F sharp. Perfect authentic cadence at the end of the chorale in the key of G major, G, B, D, and G. All in all, really the big takeaways are the mid-phrase modulations, right? We start in G, we go to E minor, and we go back to G major. Kind of uncommon. I mean, the keys are relative to one another, so it's not like he went to like B minor or C minor. C minor would be actually crazy. That's kind of far away. Like D minor. If you went to like D minor here, that would be a more interesting talking point, but the fact that he's going to the relative minor and then back to the same major key he departed from, it's not the most ambitious of modulations. Definitely something that is in Bach's wheelhouse. And also this tonic is 5/4. Starting the phrase with it as well is sort of a bold statement, kind of a modal sound, but he uses this E sort of as a pivot point to show the descending F natural and the ascending F sharp, which is pretty neat. But other than that, the chorale is fairly straightforward and operates in a fashion that I would expect of Bach. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.